Ruha Benjamin.
Thank you so much, everybody coming out on a Saturday afternoon to talk about books, to talk about science. I just want to first, before we jump into this, really acknowledge and thank James Fulgate and this institution called Eso Won Books.
Yeah.
It's been around for 23 years. In addition to the individuals that they've hosted, it gives a space to nurture the intellectual life of a community. And there are not many spaces like that. Not only right now, but historically, these kind of spaces in which we can come together across age, across all kinds of different backgrounds, and nurture the intellectual life that we have is really a privilege and an honor. So I just want to thank him. Not to mention one of my favorite authors, not Bill Clinton, although he spoke here too, but Octavia Butler. So in many ways, this ground is really sacred, and I'm just very privileged to be able to share the fruits of my labor with you this afternoon. So, I think I'm going to ask now someone to cut the lights so you can actually see some of the images. I believe, James.
Yes, I'll get them.
Okay. And so, two images that we're starting with. One will be obvious to you, which is the book cover. And then the other one is a picture with me peeking out under here, a sign that says Poetics Stem Cells. And I was so tickled to come across this sign in Singapore earlier this year, partly because I always imagined that my first book would be a book of poetry. In college, I was one of those spoken word, snap, snap, snap. Called myself having an open mic with my friends called Libations. And we charged everyone like 25 cents, and it was really fun. But I always imagined my first book, I even put it together and sent it off to like 20 presses right after college. I had just had Malachi. I had this baby. I was like, I'm going to do something. I'm going to write a book of poetry. And I sent it out and crickets. Didn't hear back from any 20 other presses. And so when I came across the sign, I was like, yes, stem cell research is actually poetic. I actually came back around to that earlier life in which poetry was my first love. So when we think about this image, people's science, it's really asking us to think about what does it mean for people across the social spectrum to participate in science and technology and medicine? Now, let me ask you by show of hands. How many of you, when you hear science or you hear someone say, let's go talk about science this afternoon, how many of you are like, that's for me? Go ahead. All right. That's for me. Let me see. All right. Notice now that's like 5, 6 people out of, let's say, 40 people, right? So the majority of us really early on in life start checking out when we hear science. Start checking out and thinking, oh, that's not for me. That's not for me. I'm a poet. I'm a literary person. I breakdance, but I don't do science, right? And so really what I'm getting us to think about is, why is that? Why do not only we check ourselves out, but why are there institutional mechanisms that check us out, that push us out, make us think this isn't for me, this is for the experts, the gatekeepers? Now, every social arena, whether it's art, whether it's sports, whatever it is, has gatekeepers. Has people there to say, okay, we are going to decide who's coming in, who's going to succeed, who's going to excel, and often it's based on all kinds of criteria that many people who are getting pushed out don't even realize is at work, okay? Science is really no different in that respect. That is, an elite small group of people are allowed to participate and excel, and the vast majority are kept out. Now, the one difference is, unlike art, unlike sports, science is really, and medicine increasingly, are about the life and death stakes, is deciding who gets to thrive, who gets to live until old age, who gets to, think about whether some new technology is going to affect our community in a perverse way. And so there is a really high stakes in the lack of participation in science and medicine in a way that is not quite palpable, is not quite as visceral as in other social arenas, although we want to think about participation and inclusion in these other settings as well. And so here we begin to think about what does it mean for all of us to feel empowered and have a stake in the creation of new novel life sciences, in the governance structures that surround it. And so this project is really a takeoff in thinking about what would real inclusion look like? What would it feel like if we all thought we had a stake in it, okay? And so here we go, thinking about the poetry in our bodies, okay? The light, the way in which biology has a sort of creative force. That word poetic, it means creative, life-producing, right? And so if you think about hematopoietic, it means that those are the blood cells, the hematopoietic stem cells that allow the recreation, the renewal of your blood cells, okay? And so if we think about, for example, every 7 days, all of our skin cells are new. Every 7 days. So if someone's getting under your skin, just wait 7 days and you're a new person. You're a new skin, right? And you can deal with it. Now, every 7 years, we have a new skeletal structure. Okay, so there gives new meaning to the 7-year itch when it comes to marriage. It's like, really, after 7 years, you are a new person and you might be like, who are you, right? And so there is already an inbuilt creative, renewal, regenerative aspect to our biology. And the beauty, the creative process of stem cell research is trying to harness that. It's trying to harness what already happens in renewal, okay? So on the one hand, the promise of it, it captures the imagination of people. It's like, wow, what if we could harness our existing ability to renew every cell, every organ, okay? And so if we look here, we see that starting from taking the 8-day-old embryo and taking the inner lining of that embryo and being able to create a culture. Now this is important. Create a culture in the petri dish that will allow us to turn it into any cell in the body so that not only can we study the disease progression of those cells, but ultimately renew different kinds of tissues. So here it says, these cells could potentially be transplanted into a patient and, treat diabetes, Parkinson's, MS, Lou Gehrig's disease, cancer, and on and on. So here I just want to give you a glimpse of the reason why it has captured the imagination of many scientists, many doctors to think, wow, what if we could harness this potential and treat these illnesses? Now, if I ended the story there, and this is where the story often ends for many people who are trying to gain support for stem cell research. They end the story with the promise, and they say, sign on, don't you love it, don't you want it? And so it seems to be a simple matter of A, B, C, all right? So if we take this, it's like, this is great, it has so much potential, sign on to it. Now, what I want to sort of implore you to think about is how the context of any new discovery, any new ability to harness biology takes shape within a culture, okay? Within, not a petri dish culture, but within a political culture, within an economic culture, so that the meaning of being able to harness that biology, that process, that biological process, can change dramatically depending on the context in which it is coming into life, right? And so if we think about that ABC, if we change what surrounds that ABC, it takes on an entirely new meaning. Okay, now that B, very simply put, here within a different context is 13. So this is just a simple illustration to say that what surrounds something can change the meaning of it very dramatically from an alphabet to the numerical sequence, okay? Because the reason why I'm pressing on you to think about this, and we're going to sort of unravel the context of stem cell research, is that many of us from about 6th grade, 7th grade, start to imagine science in a bubble, that it has no context, that is independent of human action, independent of society, right? We think of scientists as the experts over there, all right? And so we just wait for the fruits of science to trickle down to us, right? We check out. All right, and so we think of science in a bubble, and so what we're going to do in our conversation today is sort of poke that bubble and to think, oh no, science is part of society, right? Medicine is part of society. It takes shape within a context that can change not only the meaning of the thing itself, but the meaning it has for different groups of people. The people who are asked to put their bodies on the line to be experimented upon, going back to James' reference to Henrietta Lacks, right? It can change, it has a different meaning for those who can afford the therapies that grow out of it, right? When your insurance doesn't cover it, right? And so the meaning of discovering something that has a biological potential doesn't necessarily mean all hunky-dory cheerleading if you know that you will never be able to afford it, for example. Okay, that is the context in which medicine and science in the U.S. context right now is coming into being, right? And so we're thinking about trying to layer science and technology in a social context. And here, you know, MLK's famous quote really gets us thinking, right? And so he says, true compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar, right? It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. It's not about the moral failing of any one individual. It's about the moral and political failing of a structure that allows these kinds of inequalities to persist. So if we borrow some of that thinking from MLK, another way to think about it is true health is more than simply fixing bodies, right? It comes to see that a society that produces preventable, premature death needs restructuring. Preventable, premature death needs restructuring. And unfortunately, a lot of the ways that people who end the story at the promise of stem cell research, partly what they do is focus on biology as the end-all, be-all of health, rather than the way in which, for example, racism gets under your skin, or economic inequality gets under your skin, so that partly addressing our health is addressing those systems that create the context in which some people have preventable premature death, right? And so context really, really matters. And so here, this juxtaposition. We have part of the culture in which stem cell research is being, nurtured is one which immortality and the perpetual youthfulness are idealized, right? And so getting old, showing any signs of aging is something to flee from, right? Not only getting old, but the desire to never die, right? Never die to this world. So there is a fetishization of immortality in some ways. And when we start redirecting our energies towards that, often we forget, right, what is killing us in the present, right? And so if we think again about economic inequality, we think about medical insurance. And so one half of this screen is, really the culture that is nurturing stem cell, the hype around stem cell research. And one side we're asked to ignore. We don't need to focus so much on the governing of this field to ensure that people of all social strata have access to its potential fruits. We need to just focus on the promise. Let's worry about that economic inequality later. So just take a moment to reflect on these images, because a lot of times when we're asked to sign on to this field of stem cell research, we're asked to look at diabetes, Parkinson's, all these things that affect our family members. But often where a lot of the energy is being poured is into these cosmetic ways in which racial norms, gender norms, a fetishization of youthfulness are really at the forefront, right? And so here we have all these ways in which skin cells in particular are where a lot of the energy is being, input. And so bioinsurance, trying to invest in our biological life it begins to take over the imagination as opposed to straight up everyday insurance. Can I just get some Obamacare? I don't need to, look like whoever these people are. Just can I get, my kids to the emergency room instead of trying to hope the thing goes away so I don't have to pay the bill, if anybody knows what I'm talking about. Okay, so bioinsurance. Here's a quote from you'll find in People's Science. A young man who says, "Why am I in such demand as a research subject when no one wants me as a patient?" So here is this juxtaposition again, everyday access to healthcare alongside being recruited to put your body on the line so that you can hone a therapy that other people will have access to, not necessarily you. Again, the way in which the context in which this field is coming into life really matters, okay? And so here's the heart of the question that drives this book. Is stem cell research reproducing or challenging existing social hierarchies? And is the focus really on regenerating our biological selves, colonizing our imagination so that we stop paying attention to our biopolitical, our political life, right? Our economic life. And there it seems, I notice in interviewing people, that there we just seem so pessimistic. We save all of our hope and imagination for biological transformation when political transformation, economic transformation just seems like that's just the way it's always going to be, right? But somehow we believe that we can recreate our own heart and our own brain and our own spinal cord, but we can't go outside of here and recreate our community, right? And recreate, our schools and recreate our hospitals. But, we can invest money to, create a new ear if it gets torn off or recreate a new limb. And so there is the juxtaposition between where we save our hope and our imagination and where we are investing, right? And so now I'm just going to shift gears just a little bit and take you inside for just a few minutes into the actual field, narrowing it down a bit, the social field that I studied in order to think about this larger question of social inequality, social context as it relates to stem cell research. Now in 1998, this scientist, James Thompson, was the first scientist to isolate human stem cells in a laboratory. Up until then, it had been done only in animals, okay? And so this was a huge milestone, and frenzy ensued after that because it sort of opened a floodgate. Wow, if we can do this, we can start cloning people. We can start, recreating whole limbs and organs from scratch. And the key node of contention, the key debate surrounding the use of human embryos to isolate these human stem cells. And so obviously that cut across the abortion debate that's long-standing in our country and the use of human embryos and questioning, whether that was ethically all right or not. Okay, so then this thing called the stem cell debate took off, right? And you had talking heads, you had people from the Catholic Church and people on the far left, and you had, Ronald Reagan's wife, Nancy Reagan, in support, and you had Michael J. Fox. You had a lot of celebrities, and really, the main line of debate, partly mediated by prime time, was around this question of the moral status of the embryo. Now, that is an important, thing for us to discuss. But what got lost in our constant sort of refrain around the moral status of the embryo was all of these other ways in which this field and the life sciences in general are affecting and going to affect people, okay? So if we think about these questions of human experimentation, if we think about the disability rights discourse and whether, completely, trying to heal deaf people is seen as a form of eugenics on the part of some, it completely ignored, early on at least, the feminist debate around whether, we should be paying women to supply eggs for research or not. And so this is just, a little slice of what gets ignored when the media and when talking heads frame things for us, okay? And when we check out and leave it to the experts, as opposed to checking in and sort of participating in discourse, right? And so 1998, that was James Thompson. 2001, Then George Bush created a moratorium on creating new stem cell lines for that initial reason of, using human embryos. So he said, well, the lines that already exist, you scientists can continue working on them, but you can't create new ones, okay? Not with federal dollars, okay? That's the key thing. You can't create them with federal dollars. And so in a number of states, they tried to get around that. And they said, okay, you won't give us money to do this. We'll either fund it ourselves or we'll agree with you and go one step further and completely ban it and make it illegal to do, okay? So you had all these states responding to this federal policy, and California was unprecedented in its response, okay? As always, we took it to the 100th degree over here. And this is what we did. We, in 2004, created a ballot measure. Not we, but a few elite folks created a ballot measure. And so what they did was they created the largest source of stem cell research funding in the world, okay? And so what it amounted to was $3 billion over 10 years, which once it's paid back with, with interest is going to be about $6 billion. It created a new state agency devoted solely to stem cell research that's overseen by a citizens governing board. And it also created an amendment to our Constitution. Raise your hand if you knew that. People just amending your Constitution, don't even know. Okay, they created a right to research amendment, okay, requiring 70% of the legislature to modify, which in California politics means it's probably never going to happen, because they're not going to agree, 70%. Okay, so unprecedented, meaning it became the largest funder of stem cell research in the world, more than other countries, right? And so we really prioritize this. Now I'm going to come back to this 2004 ballot measure, and when we think about, what captures our imagination as a polity, all right? That's the background. This is what happened before I grew interested, okay? Now I began studying this initiative and investigating it, and as a sociologist, a qualitative researcher, I wanted to do interviews, I wanted to do content analysis of media, of documents, and I didn't just want to do it in one place. I did what's commonly referred to as a multi-sided analysis to go and follow where the issues, where the discourse, where the thing is. And often now, it's not like, anthropologists 50 years ago where you go study in a village and just like document what everyone says in one place, but things are moving, the discourse, the research is in multiple places. And in this case, my natives were scientists, were doctors, because oftentimes when it comes to stuff like the life sciences, what people want to know is, why aren't people trusting us? Why aren't they on our side? Please go find out what those colored people think about this new thing. And so they send their sociologists out to go and find out, why don't you trust us? Why don't you? And so it's the culture of those people that become the object of study rather than the culture of those who are creating the policy, creating the science, right? And so it's an important shift of lens to think about what we are studying, the questions we're asking, what becomes a curiosity. And in this case, it was curious to me, why so much investment in something when I see divestment all around me? I see divestment from schools, I see divestment from neighborhoods, I see all kinds of, and then yet we have $3 billion to pour into an initiative. And so I was interested in the culture that nurtures that, right? And so it's a shift of lens, and so it took me to the board meetings of that stem cell agency. It took me to a number of civic events in which, African Americans and Latinos were sort of being enrolled and sold on this initiative. It took me to legal hearings because 2 years after the initiative was passed, lawsuits came mostly from the far-right family values type organizations. And so they had a number of court cases. It took me to biotech industry conferences. And one of the things it did early on was they wanted to train new scientists, new researchers to become involved in stem cell research. And they gave a token 1 or 2 spots in this training program to a social scientist and a legal scholar. And so I got myself in the door that way and got a formal affiliation with the Stem Cell Agency and was trained, took bioengineering, took ethical legal class in order to be part of that first cohort of people who were funded by the new Stem Cell Agency. And then I said, okay, in addition to this policy arena, I want to go meet and talk to patients and parents of kids and others who could potentially benefit from this research. I noticed myself already, my disposition kind of jaded towards this, already thinking, kind of suspicious. And I was like, I need to temper that a bit. I need to think about, okay, what does this mean actually for people who feel or can be treated by this research? And so for that, it took me to a sickle cell clinic and also a neighboring program called a cord blood banking program. And what this program did was parents who already had a child affected by sickle cell, if they were pregnant with a new baby who was shown to be unaffected, they could, when the baby was born, take cord blood and bank it. And then if the older sibling became sick, they could have a transplant and potentially cure that older sibling. And in fact, it has worked to some extent. What this program found is that, and I talk about it in a chapter called Race for Cures, that there was a disparity, as they framed it, between Asian American families who are affected by thalassemia, which is a kind of anemia as well, undergoing the transplant at a much higher rate than African American families who were affected by sickle cell. So again, I was sent to figure out why, right? And in the meantime, I had my own questions. And so the main reason I went into this and added this site as part of the study was to understand what it means on an everyday basis, the life and death stakes of why you choose or don't choose to undergo a procedure that, and how you weigh the risks of doing this, okay? And so I talk about it more, and I can go into this a little more in Q&A. But I just wanted to give you a flavor of the qualitative sites in which I was working. All right, so now I'm going to go into one arena in the eggs for sale chapter and give you a taste of one person's story, okay? And here, I mentioned that there's been some debate about whether, so researchers, they need eggs to create embryos, to isolate stem cells, to create stem cell lines, to create cures, okay? So back up, I started with eggs. Who produces the eggs? Women. Okay, but often that gets left out of the whole thing, okay? But researchers know they need to get some women in there. But now there's an in vitro fertilization industry where people can make about how much to donate their eggs? 5,000 up to 30,000. Like if you're a Yale co-ed with blonde hair, 6 feet tall, plays tennis and the violin, you could probably get up there. Okay. So needless to say, in the private sector, you can get paid a lot of money, but there's ethical issues with paying for research, such that in California, early on they banned the payment of eggs, okay, for research purposes. And I can talk a little bit more about that. So here you have one loophole. One loophole is that in some places, if someone donates eggs for IVF and those eggs aren't used, they can make their way to stem cell research. And scientists can use the ones that aren't going to be used, okay? And so the policies, it's a patchwork about which states allow that and not. The point is, that's the backdrop, the sort of economic, political economy of Siobhan's story. So Siobhan was 20 years old at the time she responded to an ad in her local paper for, quote, African American egg donors, which offered 6,000 for eggs. Now, this is in the IVF context. Motivated by the money, Siobhan went to the clinic where she was the only prospective donor at the time who was asking a lot of questions, she reports, which seemed to annoy the clinic staff. Even so, she decided to undergo the procedure. Soon after, however, the receiving couple changed their mind and no longer wanted her eggs. At this point, the clinic staff asked Siobhan if she would, quote, be willing to donate her eggs to embryonic stem cell research, which she agreed to do because, quote, I didn't mind them being used for that. So on Thanksgiving Day 2006, Siobhan took a drug called follistim, that stimulates ovulation, which is when her experience took a turn for the worse. Now here's an extended excerpt from that interview. The retrieval went fine, but not too long after that, my stomach started to swell, and every time I leaned over, I could feel my ovaries plop. I went to see the doctor, and he told me I had OHSS, which is ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. And he then said, we see girls like you all the time. I looked 4 months pregnant. They told me to go home and eat a lot of protein. My mother was staying with me at the time, and one night my stomach was so swollen, and I could hardly breathe. My mother said, that's enough, and took me to the emergency room. The nurse stuck a needle in my stomach, and it was a loud pop I could feel, like a balloon was popped. She stuck a bag on the end of the needle to drain the fluid, and the bag filled with 2 quarts in about 5 minutes. She had to quickly put another bag on, and some of the fluid spilled on the floor. She filled the next bag too, and all 4 quarts were drained out of my stomach. I stayed in the hospital for 2.5 more days while they drained more fluid. I had a lot of pain in my abdomen. The staff at the hospital would shake their head at me and took pity on me because I was an egg donor, and they said they saw this a lot. In addition to the immediate physical toll that the ovarian hyperstimulation exacted on Siobhan, she was burdened with huge medical bills that took 1.5 years to pay. Her own fertility had been compromised owing to irregular menstrual cycles. She became pregnant in 2008 and miscarried. Siobhan's story. So, what this work is trying to do is bring in the stories of those who aren't completely represented by the promise and the hype of stem cell research, whose bodies are needed as the substrate, who are needed for experimentation, who are not necessarily going to benefit, right, from this. And so partly what's at stake is thinking about the fact that we get enamored with cures without thinking about healthcare. Now, I told you in 2004, we went to the ballot, most of you who voted, and met the majority of Californians said, yay, Prop 71. And at the same time, a minority of us voted in favor of Prop 72. Now, what was Prop 72? Prop 72 was a healthcare tax that would have extended healthcare through employment to the majority of workers in California. And so here is a direct juxtaposition between believing in the future of medicine without thinking about investing in healthcare in the present for people, right? And so it was a kernel of what became Obamacare, was partly modeled after both Massachusetts and this worker-based employment in California. So we think about what we can imagine ourselves as a society investing in and caring about. Siobhan's story, and in that initial quote about why am I in such demand as a research subject and not a patient, draw upon this imbalance in what we're willing to think about and invest in together. One of my interviewees, Leroy Moore. Leroy Moore is an amazing disability rights activist, racial justice activist. And around the time that we were all considering Prop 71, he said, as a Black disabled activist living on SSI, would Prop 71 reach my people and other people of color who are wheelchair users because of police brutality? With $3 billion going towards this research, how much will go towards social programs, healthcare, and the rundown hospitals in our cities? So Leroy, again, is asking us to think about, what does this mean for me, my community? And in doing so, he's attempting to participate in the framing of this in a way that doesn't fall within the narrow moral status of the embryo and doesn't just completely buy into the promise of this research as framed by those who are already sold on it, all right? And so moving towards conclusion, when I have that idea of people science, and really what I outlined is a lack of participation in some ways in the governance of stem cell research, in the framing of it, what I offer as an alternative is an idea of a Sankofa science. And so a Sankofa science is something, if we think about the Adinkra symbol from the Akan tradition, this bird that looks over its shoulder, looking backwards but moving forwards, okay? It's an idea in which we learn from our history, as we hear the old saying, in order to move forward. We have to know the past in order to build the future, right? So much of the way that the life sciences and the future of medicine is framed is we're just moving forward. We need to be there yesterday. We need to hurry up. You need to buy into this. We just need to keep going. And so much of the unfolding of this, as I document in the book, is an attempt to marginalize those who want to raise Sankofa-like questions and to say, we have a precedent in which these groups have been harmed by research. No. That's not relevant for now. We already learned from that. We have IRB. We have ethics. And it marginalizes those kind of questions that say Siobhan's story would say otherwise, right? And so it's not only about integrating the past, but it's integrating across the present to think about the different kinds of stakes that communities have to the discourse and to the framing and to the benefit of science and medicine, right? And so in closing, I'm going to read one other short excerpt that gives you a flavor of this reimagining of this Sankofa science, and we can open it up to discussion. So in California, where the poverty rate is already typically higher than the rest of the nation, Latinos at 22.8% and African Americans at 22.1% have substantially higher rates of poverty than whites at 9.5%. And Asians at 11.8%. Don't worry, that's the only numbers in this book, don't worry. That's all you get. The life and death implications of racialized economic inequality, in turn, are nowhere more evident than in mortality rates. In California, a black man, quote, can expect to live 68.6 years on average, which is far below the life expectancy of the average California white male, who can expect to live 75.5 years, leading a Harvard University professor of public health, Nancy Krieger, to assert in no uncertain terms that social inequality kills. Her work, among that of others, demonstrates that popular mandates and movements for social justice, for example, the civil rights movement and movements for and war on poverty, including Medicare and Medicaid, which began closing the racialized gap between rich and poor, were the primary drivers for alleviating health inequities between 1966 and 1980. In sum, a large part of moving forward entails remembering, Sankofa-like, what has worked in the past, rather than allowing ourselves to be hypnotized by the latest shiny innovation promising to revolutionize health, but rather than embracing ourselves for a roller coaster of progress and retrenchment corresponding to changes in political administrations, we need to tackle a much more fundamental question. Not simply what kinds of policies and initiatives do we wish to undertake, but also who are the agents of change. Here I draw upon a new wave of sociological thinking about, quote, real utopias, which challenge us to imagine and create institutions and social relations that are fundamentally different from the status quo. As 2012 president of the American Sociological Association, Eric Olin Wright, describes it, a real utopia embraces the tension between dreams and practice. It is founded on the belief that what is pragmatically possible is not fixed independently of our imaginations, but is itself shaped by our visions. Self-fulfilling prophecies are powerful forces in history. Nurturing clear-sighted understandings of what it would take to create social institutions free of oppression is part of creating a political will for radical social changes to reduce oppression. A vital belief in a utopian ideal may be necessary to motivate people to leave on the journey from the status quo in the first place, even though the likely actual destination may fall short of the utopian ideal. He emphasizes that real utopias are ideals that are grounded in the real potentials of humanity, utopian destinations that have accessible way stations, utopian designs of institutions that can inform our practical task of muddling through in a world of imperfect conditions for social change. In a similar vein, at the Science and Democracy Lecture Series at Harvard in 2010, writer and activist Arundhati Roy exhorted participants, the first step towards reimagining a world gone terribly wrong is to stop making war on those who have an altogether different understanding of what constitutes happiness and fulfillment. Consider that throughout the previous pages, you have been introduced to many people willing to invest money and time to hone scientific techniques that might defy what were once accepted as laws or limits of biology as they relate to aging and illness. As when the journalist Terry Summers asks us to, quote, imagine cardiac cells beating in a petri dish, being used to form human tissue that might be used to replace damaged heart muscle. But somehow, imaginations go limp when we are confronted with social disorder. For many people, the idea that we can defy politics as usual and channel human ingenuity towards more cooperative and inclusive forms of social organization is utterly far-fetched. Thus, I'm convinced that any institutional retooling must begin by first querying our faith in biological regeneration alongside our underdeveloped belief in social transformation. If our bodies can regenerate, why do we perceive our body politic as so utterly fixed? Thank you.
Thank you.
Lights on now. I told you that I always imagined my first book was going to be a book of poetry. And the title of that book, I had a title because I sent it out. The title of that book was Plastic-Free Sofas and Other Liberation Symbols. Now, for those of you who've been to my grandmother's house off of 48th on 4th Avenue, know that I grew up in a house, not anymore, but I grew up in a house that had plastic-covered sofas, right? Raise your hand if you grew up in a house. Raise your hand. Double check. Okay. Plastic-covered sofas. Now, I grew up in this house, and I love this house. This house was full of love and warmth and the most amazing grandma and some people who have spent a lot of time in that house, right? And later in life, that plastic came off, and I started imagining, in many of our houses, the public space for many years, the place where you invited company in, where you talked, where you gathered, had this plastic on it to preserve it, right? So that it will last a long time. You can be going out buying new couches every 5 years, and all the kids and the grandkids getting stains, everything, right? So you had to have that plastic on so that the kids come, the scuff comes, you can wipe it off and keep on going. Last decades, right? The public place in our houses, we wanted to preserve, right? But at the same time, I'm thinking about public space, not just living rooms, but our civic life, right? And the way in which, in many ways, we live and inhabit a civic sphere that's plastic, that is trying to be preserved, but what that preservation means is that we're not getting dirty, we're not getting in the mix, we're not leaving our mark, our imprint, right? And so for me, plastic-free sofas became a kind of liberation symbol in the sense that, it's time to get dirty. It's time to, think about things in ways that aren't simply about preservation, but are about transformation, right? And so this is my homage to that first book that never got published, but which I share with you here today. Thank you.